afternoon, secular fam. I hope that you are having a fantastic Friday. I want to give a big shout out to Changing Hands Bookstore and author Scott Latta for the great event last night at their Tempe location. Our handler Will was fantastic. The crowd had tons of thoughtful questions, and lo and behold, I got a shirt. So show some love to your local independent bookstores today. Yeah, it was, by the way, the name of Scott's book is Gods of the Smoke Machine. He spoke with us about 5 months ago. It's out now. And let me just tell you that it was incredible. I feel like I know a lot about Christian nationalism and megachurches, but his book really was eye opening even for me. I give it 5 stars. Can't recommend it enough. Go ahead and get it from Changing Hands or your local independent bookstore if you're joining us from elsewhere. And if you're so moved, send a few copies to us for our annual banned book fundraiser. It's really our way of being able to raise funds and educate people at the same time. But for today, we are speaking with Dr. Sara Moslener. It's been over 2 years since we've spoken with her, and if you ask me, that's just too darn long. She is the lead of the After Party Project, co-editor at Evangelical Purity Culture and its Discontents, and the forthcoming, in just a few weeks here, December 2025, her new book, After Purity, Race, Sex, and Religion in White Christian America. Dr. Moselener is a writer, researcher, and lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, Anthropology, and Religion at Central Michigan University, where she teaches courses on the history of religious and racial discrimination in the United States. She has been studying evangelical purity culture for over 15 years and has numerous publications, including the book Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence, which demonstrates how sexual purity campaigns and rhetoric have been used by white Protestants since the 19th century to obtain greater political power and cultural influence. And holy moly, it's like I can't have my eyes open and not see it everywhere. So thank you so much for joining us today. I forgot to ask at the beginning. It's Moslener, right?
That's right. Yeah, very good.
Okay, good, good. All right, I'm going to hand it over to you and I will field any questions. So if you do have questions, folks, make sure that you click the little button that says everybody and go ahead and check in, tell us where you're from. So go ahead, Sara.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you today. Let's see. I am going to go ahead and share my brief PowerPoint here so you can see. Um, so this is the book After Purity, Race, Sex, and Religion in White Christian America. It will be officially out December 9. So things are kind of picking up with that. But this is, I guess, officially my the first stop on my book tour. So thank you very much for letting me kind of figure this out. I am a huge admirer of, do you call yourself secular AZ or secular Arizona?
Either one works. They're
Either
both
one.
good.
Yeah, yeah. I'm delighted to be here again. I think the work that you're doing, that you all are committed to is the most important work we can be doing right now. Aside from making sure people have the food they need. I mean, in this very moment. This is why I teach what I teach. That we have work to do as citizens of the United States. We have not done a good job of identifying what it means to be a citizen of the United States and we've not done a good job of teaching and learning that. And that's what I want to talk about today. And sort of the contribution that After Purity makes to that. So I'm calling my talk today Righting Historical Wrongs. Oftentimes I will title my talks Righting Religious Wrongs, but today I thought I would focus on history and the way that we are under and miseducated about the history of the place we live. So A little more about me. So, yes, I am at Central Michigan University. If you know the hand, we are right in the middle of the palm of the Lower Peninsula. Um, I have been studying evangelical purity culture for a long time. After purity started out as an interview study, I interviewed people who grew up and out of evangelical purity culture. Um, and since my first book came out in 2015, the number of people studying purity culture has just grown exponentially, and that's been really exciting to see, and also to know that I can kind of take a break and maybe find other things to think about. Um, but much of that research, appropriately so, is often situated in fields like counseling psychology and helping people sort of do the recovery work of religious and sexual trauma. Um, there aren't as many people who are doing asking historical questions about purity culture, um, as situated in the United States and the way it intersects with nationalistic ideologies like white Christian nationalism. So I'm really glad that that is the one of the pieces that I contribute to the conversation. Um, Finally, I want to say this project, this book, the research I did would not have been possible without funding from two great places, the Louisville Institute and also the Luce Project on Religion and Sexual Abuse. They gave me the opportunity to take a break from teaching, so I could focus on my research, and those are not easy opportunities to come by, and I would not be here without that. So I'm really grateful. Okay, so um, so why after purity? Why this title? I want to tell you about sort of a little bit about the methodology of after purity. Um, but I want to show you an image that I took that has sort of become my personal um, representation of after purity over here on the right. This is a view of the San Francisco Bay from the Albany Bulb. And it's a beautiful place. It was a former construction debris landfill, which was reclaimed by local artists. And so when you visit now, you see these gorgeous sculptures made out of rebar and other sort of reconstituted garbage, made into this beautiful, beautiful art, and it's right on the bay. And so there was something about sort of reclaiming garbage and turning it into something beautiful that reminded me of the people I interviewed and the work that they needed to do to kind of relearn who they were after growing up in white evangelical culture, after sort of going into marriage, going into adulthood, believing all the things they did about evangelical purity culture. And so I thought I would include that. I hate PowerPoints that are just words, so I always like to zhuzh it up a little bit. So So today I'm going to read some excerpts from the introduction to the book as a way to prompt a conversation about a crisis that I have been observing and experiencing as a university lecturer. We in the United States do not know our history. We do not know what history is. We do not know what it means to do history and why it matters. And this is by design. And I include myself in this as someone with a PhD in US religious history. The things I have learned, even in my teaching life, especially about the history of racism in the United States, astounds me because these were not things that I learned in my K through 12 education. And so much of that stuff is foundational. I ask my students, I teach a course called Religion, Race, and Discrimination in the US. That's the primary course that I teach. I live in a town that that is home to the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe, an Anishinaabe, part of the Anishinaabe Nation. Um, Mount Pleasant was home to a Native American boarding school in the early 20th century. So there's some deep, painful history here in this town. Um, and and so when I teach about this to my students, I ask them who has studied Native American history, who has studied Native American culture. Um, and once I had one student raise their hand, and they were Canadian. So, um, so I have gone off on a couple different rants in front of my students about this, but I've also think deeply about it. Why is it? Why is it that we do so poorly at talking about the history of the United States? Um, I believe it is by design. It is very much a result of of settler colonialism, of establishing a nation on genocide, on terrorism, and other things that best be forgotten. Um, and so and so here we are in a place that I truly believe that if we understood the history of the United States, if we were able to really come to terms with it, we would not be in the political crisis we are in. Authoritarianism benefits from historical ignorance. And After Purity is a book about that, about how the deployment of what I call myths of innocence, both collective in terms of national ideologies and also individual in terms of personal moral choices, have trained us into a complacent and defensive posture. So that's what I want to talk about today. So, the first goal of After Purity is to listen and contextualize the stories of people who grew up and out of evangelical purity culture. And I want to make sure you understand, right? How do we get from teenagers taking pledges, right, in the 1990s to not have sex, to an entire nation that is unwilling to come to terms with its history? So the answer to that has to do with the people I interviewed for my research. I wanted to listen to and contextualize their stories. And so I conducted an interview study during the pandemic. I interviewed over 60 people. Uh, and most of these overwhelmingly were former evangelicals, many of whom identify as ex-evangelical. Um, and most were white women. And it's white womanhood that is the connection between purity culture and myths of national innocence. Historically, white evangelical women have been the avatars of sexual purity, an association that in the 19th century was used to maintain racial segregation and project national innocence. And many other things, which I get into the book, including the justification of racial terror in jails. So the emergence of sexual purity as a concept was deeply racialized and part of the work to make sure the boundaries between Black and white stayed very firm. And of course, this would become even more important when slavery ends and you don't have an institution that does that. Okay. It was also used to justify Jim Crow laws. Um, the need to protect white women, because the ideology of sexual purity in the 19th century was that white women are innately sexually pure, which was, of course, a reversal of 2,000 years of Christian theology, which said just the opposite, right? That women were spiritually, morally inferior. Um, and so what happens is, in the 19th century, white women become these standard bearers of what it means to be American, of the possibility of the United States as a nation. And and so studying the cultural meanings of white womanhood, which is very much what After Purity is about, right? Cultural meanings of white womanhood, we can better understand the nationalistic ideologies that are invested in myths of innocence, right? So the original myth here is the myth of white women's sexual purity. And that gets parlayed into a nationalistic ideology about the nation being pure, being innocent of its past. Okay. Um, so here's one excerpt from the introduction to After Purity. Um, and what, and I'm happy to, I know we'll do questions at the end, but I'm also happy to answer some immediately after this reading about what I've just read. So this is about a page and a half. So from the introduction. Long before adolescence became a category of human development and a site of civilizational promise, nation building projects of the 19th century regarded white women as progenitors of national greatness. Reversing almost 2 centuries of Christian theological theology that regarded women, pardon me, yes, that regarded women as morally, spiritually, and physically inferior, 19th century gender ideologies popularized among American Protestants constructed a white racial ideal bound up with the reproductive and alleged civilizing capacity of true womanhood. True womanhood was a term that was coined in the 1960s by a feminist historian to talk about um, the the ideologies of womanhood in the 19th century that were, of course, more ideal than real. Efforts toward white women's full political enfranchisement benefited from this shift, with prominent women leaning heavily on their own presumed virtues to argue for increased political enfranchisement. Often these arguments were made at the expense of people of color, whose humanity was further devalued as white women's representational status increased. In my book, Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence, I argue that sexual purity as a practice and rhetoric has been utilized by white Protestant evangelicals to secure and maintain their own political dominance. As such, sexual purity has been a tool for building a white Christian America, with white womanhood serving as both beacon and boundary for its creation. In the 19th century, white Protestants established a nationalistic narrative asserting that the fate of the United States as a geopolitical and economic power rested on the iconic symbolism of white women's ability to birth and nurture a great civilization. A particular a particularly telling embodiment is portrayed in this image. John Gast's allegorical 1872 painting, American Progress, in which national growth and vitality is embodied by white womanhood. Created for a travel brochure advertising the American West, Gast's painting depicts a white woman, the allegorical Columbia, holding a school book and laying telegraph wire as she floats westward in attire that can be seen as either angelic or neoclassical. The sky ahead of her is dark and cloudy, and the group of indigenous people and untamed animals are forced to cower in her blinding presence. Behind her, the clear horizon illuminates an eastern coastline, busting with commerce, while beneath her, enlightened by her presence, are white men with domesticated animals ready to plow the land and reap its harvest. Gast's American progress would become synonymous with the doctrine of manifest destiny, an ideology purporting that white settlers were entitled to land expansion without regard for the bodies of the inhabitants already present. Manifest Destiny extolled a sexually pure white womanhood that obscured numerous forms of racialized violence, perpetuated against enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and other non Europeans and non Christians. The mythic innocence of white womanhood functioned as a nationalistic trope that white women could and did choose to embrace for the benefit of their sex, their race, and their nation. Of course, this protected status could only be maintained by excluding non white women from this symbolic position. So that's the first excerpt. I'm going to read another one. Um, but before we move on, I just wanted to ask if there are any initial questions about what I just read, specifically about this, because we're going to move on to the 19th century. So I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with what's going on in the 19th century and with the Gast painting.
I will just, there is one question here that I feel like you can answer right now. James is asking, how far back in history does your book go? I'm curious about the drivers behind the First Amendment Establishment Clause.
Yes. So I do not go back to the founding. I go back to the earliest, uh, the earliest that I have seen reference to sexual purity, and that is in the publication of Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which was published in 1862. And so, timeline wise, that is where the book starts, even though the book doesn't function chronologically, but historically, that's where I go back to. And I think, and not that I mean, and it is interesting to see that happen, that um, right, that white women are going to come to be only in the 19th century associated with purity, with piety, um, and that'll be for very specific reasons. So
Mhm.
that's why I mean the history of sexual purity is very much rooted in the 19th century um, as a component of U.S. nation building.
Okay. And one thing, there's a couple comments here, and I immediately thought about it too. But this painting, somebody pointed out that it's been posted recently on a lot of social media, the government social media accounts, which is like how apparently we're governing now. We're
Yeah,
announcing that we're like, sinking boats and doing all kind, but just a tweet. That's just how we govern now, apparently.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yeah, but I thought immediately too, they've also revamped these. Like they have taken this painting, from 150 years ago, and they're recreating that vibe. There is
mhm,
not one single person of color in the new American propaganda.
right.
It's Ian says added some velociraptors and eagles and AK-47s. I mean, they might
Yeah.
as well do that. But yeah, so I think that's probably it for now. Let me just see. Hence the white American exceptionalism of today.
Yeah.
It also clears up the way the manifest destiny was used as an entitlement across the country and overseas. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, yes. And I did so I wrote for Religious Dispatches when that first came out because it was from the Department of Homeland Security. They had a couple different pieces. I think Department of Health and Human Services has a similar, like, you can see it looks very, like, and that stuff looks very Cold War imagery. But yeah, so you can see there's this visual culture of white Christian nationalism that you can see on government social media right now. But I did write a piece uh, on DHS using this image. And so you can find that if you go to religion dispatches and Google my name, you should be able to find it. Um, yep, exactly. All right.
Um, all right. Yeah, you can go right ahead. I'll continue to monitor. We can save the other questions that are coming in for a little bit later, I think.
Okay, good. Yeah. So the second goal of after purity um, is to problematize these myths of national innocence that have very much captivated us, have very much um, gone from, right, being in a sense a collective delusion to being part of our individual psyches. One thing I also do is I study, this book is also a lot about whiteness as a racial category. So I spend a lot of time, I teach a lot about um, what it means to talk about the history of white racial identity, which is very much about, um, right, promoting myths of innocence. So that is something that I try to do in this book is understand, how do these myths function, right? How is it that they function both collectively? How is it that we are so convinced of them to the point where we are, you know, able, where, where some are willing to take up arms and storm the capital of the very nation they claim to love, where we are willing to sort of see enemies of people who are of different races or religions, right? So that we've been very much kind of socialized into this defensive posture when our innocence is questioned. um, so I tell stories in After Purity of people who embodied these myths. Um, in their sexual choices, but alongside myths about our national past. And that's part of my story as well. One of the things that I did with After Purity, once I realized that a big theme coming out of my interviews was disembodiment, I realized that I could be the traditional, uh, you know, scholar, right? The sort of removed voice of all knowing. And so I started writing creative nonfiction and sorting through my own past. And so those are sort of peppered throughout as a way to provide another layer of thinking about that. So, so, so what I've thought a lot about is the way that, when we live in the hyper individualistic culture that we do, we learn to believe that our stories are singular, right? That they are disconnected from other people's experience, that we are kind of self-made and unique, and that this is sacred. Um, but when we do that, we run the risk of misunderstanding the way that our lives follow certain political and religious trajectories, especially for any of us who were born into religious communities that are shaped by white Christian nationalism, right? I mean, this is a book about people continuing to unpack, having lived through that moment. And it's been really interesting, because a big part of this project is religious trauma. And so seeing people who experience significant gender, sexual, and religious trauma from their religious communities, and then having, the political version of their family become our political landscape is, you know, how do you, right? So, people who've grown up in white Christian nationalism are having to do so much work to simply, like, keep their wits about them. I am one of them. I mean, just how do we kind of get through this authoritarian moment, I hope, moment. Um, I mean, and so many of us know what that feels like in our bodies because of growing up like Christian nationalism. Um, so I want to read another excerpt, um, and then I can stop again for some questions. So we're problematizing innocence myths. And after Purity, I investigate the myths that perpetuate illusions of innocence about bodies, white racial identity, and national greatness. Each of these necessitates the practice of disembodiment, a cognitive state that devalues or dismisses the lived experiences of the body and how our bodies situate us within systems of privilege and oppression. For people who grew up in and out of purity culture, this has meant struggling to accept and learn from sexual and other bodily desires. It has meant extended periods of recovery from gender based and sexual violence. For white people, it has meant being socialized into color evasive ideologies about race and then struggling to understand or even disdaining claims about the systemic nature of racial inequality. In both cases, ignoring the body is mistakenly lauded as a virtue. Denying the sexual prompts of one's body has often been a sign of holiness in the Christian faith tradition. Likewise, claiming to not see race is presumed to be a virtuous stance regarding racial difference. In both cases, these disembodied practices perform significant violence, as erasure of bodies and their needs means developing cognitive habits that refuse to see harm if it conflicts with our established innocence myth. Innocence myths. It's hard to say. Um, In her book, Against Purity Living Ethically in Compromised Times, social and political theorist Alexis Shotwell interrogates the desire for purity, pointing toward the ways that human beings are already and always implicated and contaminated by the pollutants we seek to protect ourselves from. Efforts to seek and obtain purity, Shotwell explains, deny the ways we are formed in connection to one another and to our pasts, cultivating illusions of individual and collective innocence. Among white people, cultivating purity and innocence creates what she calls a dilemma of disembodiment, where, quote, ignorance, repression, and active disavowal, end quote, encourage practices of historical amnesia. Myths of innocence cannot withstand historical truth telling. When a crisis of purity erupts around adolescent sexuality or national identity, innocence demands a return to something that signals a presumed source of truth, virtue, and safety, doubling down on the illusion that the status quo offers just that. Among former evangelicals raised to embody the virtue of sexual purity, resisting the privileges ascribed to white Christian citizenship requires dismantling many of the myths used to preserve the beliefs that the USA is once and always destined for greatness. Since 2016 and the first election of Donald Trump, many white evangelicals have come to realize that greatness is often far from goodness. What was already a slow exodus has become a thunderous retreat from Christian denominations and churches that had grown used to their religious claims and engendering political influence. For the people departing these institutions, this often means separation from or conflict with families, close knit communities, and belief systems that are invested in and tangibly benefit from the tenets of white Christian nationalism. For those who leave, it has meant recognizing how theological orthodoxy among white Christians is born of the same tree that produces the strange fruit of racial and sexual violence.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so hold on. There are a few questions and comments. This, and I think this is a good one. This one comes from Julie from the Q&A. Sarah, at what point do former victims of the purity culture recognize that they were part of a more discriminative and restrictive game plan?
Mhm. Yeah, so that was part of the trickiness of doing my interviews. I did not, um, and of course, staying within the ethical framework of it. I didn't advertise it as being about white racial identity. I did ask people to identify themselves racially, and I got like 15 different answers, which is how I begin one of my chapters. I did have some
Mhm.
people talk about white racial identity, um, and but not very many. And I had some people get upset with me when they heard me on podcasts talking about the book and asked to be taken out of the study um, because of the questions I was asking about whiteness and white womanhood in particular. And that actually taught me a lot about trauma, right? And the way that
Mm.
that trauma is replicated, the way that trauma is weaponized, and because of course part of white womanhood um, is the socialization of white womanhood is learning that you deserve protection at all costs, and we've seen numerous examples of that even in our present moment. And so yes, so there's work to be done. And I think part of this, a lot of the reason why I wrote the book was for people who have this past in purity culture and are doing the work around their sexuality, that they understand that the purity culture wasn't just a way of forming your sexuality and your gender identity. It was also a process of racial formation. And so this is helping people to be able to see that. And of course, all you can do is kind of offer that and see how people respond. I will say, in the research that is happening, um, is very much in line with the arguments I'm making today. There is very much a prioritization of thinking about race, thinking about whiteness, and finding you know more the experiences of purity culture from perspectives other than white women. But there are sort of, kind of popular, um, and this it gets to chapter 7 of the book. There are some popular, who I call kind of post purity influencers who really are not willing to engage questions around race, and that has not served them well. And so I write about them in the book and say this is what it looks like when we think about purity culture as only about our individual sexual health, right? Because this was not this. There's so much more going on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, absolutely big challenge and sort of one I'm just stepping into.
Mm-hmm. It's like you just said something that really made me think about our current timeline. White this idea, this portrayal of white women needing protection, and I immediately think of the influencer Tizzy Ent, right? The guy that kind of he exposes bad behavior of mostly white people, and so he has a lot of, and then he does these follow-ups where he'll show somebody, using racial slurs or being threatening, and then he'll say, who is this person? And oftentimes people will come out and, then they'll get fired from their jobs or whatever, right? Um, but there's the idea of a Karen, right? Like
Mm,
I think about the birder the
Mhm.
black birder in New York City, I think it was, who, I mean, she's like recording herself pretending to be targeted by this man. And it's like that,
Yeah.
like they're so oblivious to their privilege and
Mhm.
they feel so justified to complain about so many things.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I just went to see Christian Cooper. He was the birder, and at Michigan State, he has a new book out, and yeah, he's such a lovely person.
Mhm. I mean,
Um,
and I absolutely love that horrible interaction worked out much more in his favor than in hers,
mhm.
Um and I
Yeah,
and I am grateful actually for
yeah,
people who will expose these people out in the wild because it's important that we call it out. Like
yeah,
I go to school board meetings where they are considering the most Christian nationalist policies that you can imagine, the most restrictive, the most xenophobic, misogynistic, you name it, and they're so oblivious to their own privilege. And in fact, and I really believe that they think that when they say things like, "Oh, I don't see color," that they are morally superior than the rest of us. And it's
yeah,
like, but there's no opportunity to explain.
yeah, yeah. And I think one of the important things to understand, I think even now, right, when racism has become even more overt, um, that the most common form of racism is still color evasion, right? It's still the idea that, I don't see race. Um, and that when people are challenged on that, right, that's when conflict surfaces. um and so, yeah, so I'm really trying to speak into that and hopefully, give people some historical grounding, some anecdotal grounding in the stories I tell of the people I interviewed, and my own stories. um and um and writing this really kind of gave me a framework for thinking about how I grew up, how I learned to think about race. And for me, growing up in the 1980s, it was all about the myth of the welfare queen. I was part of the pro life movement. And so, you know, the whole sexual purity thing I learned was about being responsible with my body, right? I'm not going to be one of those people who acts irresponsibly and then, has to become dependent on the federal government, right? So there's so many of these narratives that are deeply racialized, that are deeply classist. Um, and what I thought for me was sort of me becoming a good Christian was actually about me becoming a white woman. And so I do a lot of that unpacking in the book.
You know, currently there's a there's just so much like meta drama around school board stuff too because of social media and like
Mm,
all these Facebook groups, Twitter feeds, et cetera, et cetera. And there's one particular school board member who, very loudly advertises that she is a Christian and perceives, whether she really perceives it this way or it's her way of like stirring drama, I'm not really sure, but she perceives everybody else to be demonic, satanic. If you're a woman, you are a Jezebel. That word is thrown around a lot, and she uses it against the very Christian, like employee, people who are running the district,
right,
the wife
right.
of a superintendent. And she's really, and I just thought about it the other day about, I bet that really bothers, the wife of the superintendent, that she's just throwing this word around because she's a good Christian woman who was raised, with that word being associated with, wantonness and just freely giving yourself sexually and manipulating men and all that kind of stuff. Um,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
and and the weaponization. Go ahead, yeah. I just
yeah,
wanted your
yeah.
thoughts on that.
Well, and I think it helps to think, more about Christianity in the United States with more nuance, right? So much of this is a battle over what it means to be Christian, as much as it is a battle over what does it mean to be American.
Mhm.
And so usually people who are using that harsher language are people who come out of traditions that embrace spiritual warfare. And of course, we see more and more of these people either using this rhetoric or, are a part of these, churches that do so, and they're not newly in the federal government. I mean, I remember, if you remember when Sarah Palin ran for office. She was, part of this tradition. Um, but there are some really great podcasts and people kind of doing the real deep dives on this. And if you go, so I do some work with Straight White American Jesus, and they have some great like feature podcasts now where they get experts to write about or to do podcasts about like the New Apostolic Reformation, right? And so these religious groups that are that for so long have been outliers even within American Christianity have really kind of taken the center. And so it's interesting, so I think it is whenever I teach about white Christian nationalism, I show my students like, oh yeah, and here's the group Christians against Christian nationalism, right? So this is an internal debate. Um, and of course, but one that is very much about, answering questions about, being in the United States.
Mhm.
So yeah, and again, and of course, part of that is are the different ways that we interpret the history of the United States and the different uh, and since this is something that we do not prioritize, it really, um, yeah, we just sort of keep spinning around and around
Mm.
over it. And so,
Yeah, yeah,
sorry,
for sure.
just reading the chat.
Yeah. Like I said, I need talent first. So the last time you were here, you talked a little bit about trad wives and the
Mhm.
influence of trad wives. And this could just be an anecdotal, maybe not research based thing, but are you seeing the same kind of influence with trad wife accounts that you did 2 years ago? Is their influence like waning at all?
I actually asked my students this the other day because we talked about white Christian nationalism, and I said, like trad wives are a part of this, and I asked them, and they said they hadn't really been seeing as much, which was interesting, because I haven't either. And usually I hear, because I don't follow them, but if they'll be getting, but I think that they're sort of they were very popular um, during the campaign, right? In
Hmm.
the run up to the campaign. And so it's interesting to think of because women, so I've done some research on read research on the role of women in far right groups. And oftentimes, and the role of women in groups, whether it's like the Klan or, whatever, is to sort of be the front facing, right,
The,
guard.
the Erica Kirk right now. I mean, that's who the front facing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. As a way, right? And this gets to the myth of innocence, right? White women are supposed to make us calm. They're supposed to be reassuring and tell us that we're doing the right thing. Because of course they're white women, right? They only want what's best for their children. So they want what's best for us, right? So the myths of innocence are very much being used in that same way. And I feel like the trad wife movement was absolutely that. And so it's not surprising to me that now, right now that the show has happened, right, they can recede a little bit and go back to their supportive roles. um,
Mhm.
and so it's interesting to think about that. There's some great research on sort of the unique role that women play. And in fact, the last chapter of my book turns to white women who participated in January 6th, and how when they were arrested, they were like, I didn't do any, like they just claimed innocence. Um, And how, and even when they went in with their lawyers would say, like, she's a mother, she's a great, like, this is all the caregiving work that she does, and trying to, kind of really exploit this myth of white women's innocence. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
I am not a big fan of pornography, but videos of white women getting arrested is probably one of my favorite things. Yeah. The entitlement. I don't know if you saw a few months back or earlier this year, Mary Lou Retton, who I grew up like worshiping and idolizing, and then I find out that she's an anti-vax, anti-mask,
Oh, no.
Trumper. I know it's heartbreaking, but watching her drunk, really drunk. First of all, sad, very sad. She's on an
Mhm.
oxygen tank. She's got all kinds of health issues.
Yeah.
But watching her get arrested, I have to admit, I enjoyed it. Yeah, Mary Lou Retton, unfortunately, is a full on Trumper. I
Mhm.
just wonder if the women who carry water for these men will ever realize that the leopards will, in fact, one day eat their face. You know.
Hello, Francesca. Right, yeah. I made the mistake of trying to have that conversation with some Turning Point students on my campus, who were all women. And I just said to them, like, they don't have your best interest at hand. And they ended up recording me and sending it to Charlie. And yeah, that was, yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
you were on the professor watch list.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know what? And I'm sorry that that happened to you, but also that just means that you're kick ass. So there's that.
Yeah, but I haven't even been able to think and talk about, yeah, his murder, because yeah, it's
I
been, yeah, yeah.
I I completely understand that. Yes. Here's a
There
question
Yeah, did you
coming
see
from
Julie's
Julie.
question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julie says, I'm curious what is effective in combating purity culture. Do overtly sexual messages to take back words and identity, like the slut walks from a decade ago, work?
Yes, in many ways, I would say so. I think, and that's, part of a larger feminist project, is to sort of reclaim that. Among evangelicals, there's an evangelical podcast called Holy Coitus, Heauxly. And she was like, look, I'm living abroad, I'm in my hoe phase, I grew up in purity culture. And so she kind of popularized the term hoe phase. And but this does get to um this really interesting question of sorry, I keep looking at the chat and be like, oh, that's a damn. um you know uh, uh, of because there are a lot of stories that don't end up in the book of sort of how people work their way out of purity culture. And the thing is, it's one thing to say, I don't believe this anymore. It's another thing to say, now I know what gives my body pleasure. And those stories are incredible. And some of them get pretty wild. But the things that people learned about themselves, and not just around like sexual identity, but also around sexual practices and all sorts of things. And so yeah, so there is a sort of sexual revolution among the evangelicals, which is pretty interesting to see. And I see sort of reclaiming those terms as being part of that. So I hope that's
Mhm.
what you were asking. Um,
Yeah, I'm a big fan of I used to be of the Plathville show that was on like TLC. It's very exploitative, but there's one the woman like Olivia Plath who married into this family was herself raised in this kind of evangelical tradition, but has now just become she's one of my favorite people to as an influencer to watch because she just talks about all the things that she wasn't allowed to talk about and breaks it down for people. It's a great evangelical
yeah.
follow. Again, Olivia Plath. Let's see. So here's a question from Jennifer. She says, I'm curious if there are any discussions of what more progressive white women could do to combat this. I know I've experienced the tension of just trying to educate them. Oh my gosh, for real. They're so sensitive.
Yeah. There's a question right above that too. I don't want you to miss that one. It's
Oh, yeah. We'll get to that one after. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, there are so many books along the lines of, white women stop being racist and get over yourselves. So there's a whole bunch of literature on it. Um, and a lot of good conversations on social media, and so it's been interesting to follow those, and it can get a little overwhelming, right, because it's very heightened rhetoric, and it's hard not to catch the feels of it. I mean, I've been studying this. I've been doing anti-racist work. I try and create an anti-racist classroom without my students knowing, right? Because that one um and yet, like, it's easy to kind of feel like, like, am I doing all of this just so I can, claim my own innocence, right? Claim, well, like, well, I
Mm,
am one of the good ones, right? And so it's a matter of accepting, right, this work is never going to be done. And you can't um Eh, the other thing I see, especially because I am a former evangelical, and a lot of former evangelicals still have the urgency to proselytize. And so this becomes something else to proselytize. And that makes me really uncomfortable because I think a lot of anti racism work among white people starts to look just like that, like, oh, come, we know the salvation, right, and it's doing this anti-racism work. That is how you become good again. And the way that it tracks in that same way. And so I don't know how people sort of outside of evangelicalism who come from, non-religious, but I feel like, once again, Christianity has co-opted anti-racism in that way. So there's so
mhm,
many levels, right? So all that to say, like, if you have the urgency to proselytize, right, to change people's hearts, you can also interrogate that. And think about, what are the ways, right? It has everything to do with, right, what do you say when you show up to a school board meeting, right? There are many examples of people you would not expect saying beautiful things at school board meetings, right? The ways that what you teach your children, so there are so many ways in just our daily lives that
mhm,
we can, because these are things we need to practice for ourselves. And I
mhm,
think when we practice that, it feels more authentic to who we are. Um, and um, and that should be, but for me, that is the best way for me to focus. And of course, I have the extra infrastructure of being a scholar, and knowing that I have to work within those boundaries.
mhm. So, speaking of being a scholar, this will be the last question and then we'll close. But do you identify as a feminist scholar?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I first went to graduate school, I went to seminary, and I worked in the field of feminist theology. And so that was my initial questions were um, about gender and sexuality, and religion, and especially sexism and patriarchy, and wanting to sort of unpack my experiences with those, wanting to understand what those concepts were and how they shaped me. Um, and 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 I was very lucky in that, I started graduate school in the early 2000s, and by that time, when you studied feminism, you studied intersectional feminism. And so to study feminism was also to study about race.
Mhm,
And once you start reading bell hooks, and you just don't go back from there.
mm,
So that was, so yeah, so I've that has served me really, really well. What's interesting, so when I was studying theology, that work was really easy to do.
right.
um, but then when I went to graduate school in a religious studies program, it was much harder to do. It's like you either had to study gender and sexuality in religion, or race and religion.
Mm,
And that it seems to be a problem in the field of religious studies still. So that's something I'm trying to address with this book. But but yes,
Well,
yeah, I
and
would
all
say
these white women who hold up the, Christian patriarchy, authoritarian patriarchy are, they're trying to just do away with any kind of discussion about our many different identities that we may hold all
yes,
at once. Yeah,
yes,
very
yeah.
depressing.
Yes.
Well, okay, you've heard it here, folks. White women are the problem. No. I mean,
And which also means we're the solution, which means
exactly.
have a lot of work to do, a lot of work. So,
So speaking of solutions, what does give you hope in 2025?
yeah, right now, the new mayor of New York City has given me hope. So, yeah, yeah. And I know, like, I mean, every election is a pendulum swing, so, it's not surprising, but it does, it does shift our public discourse. And yeah, so I'm riding that hope for a little bit. I mean, I think the people of New York City will be well served. I don't think that any elected person is above critique, above accountability. I also think he had some easy shoes to fill. Um, so yeah, but yeah, but it's good to kind of see this, especially, next week my class we talk about Islamophobia. Um, and this is an opportunity, I saw a couple of friends of mine who study Islamophobia like able to get some stuff published on it, because of this. And I think there are so many conversations, which like we're so overwhelmed right now with the noise, right? The signal and the noise, right? That there are so many dots that we are just having to ignore because there's too much. And so I think, Mamdani's election kind of brightens one of those points where we need to say, oh, yeah, we need to talk about that. So,
Mhm. I
so
know for, and I always use my children who are in their 20s as the example of, they were sold back in 2016 with Bernie and free, free healthcare, free education, free, childcare, and like those are not dirty, despicable things. And so if that is the at the forefront of your message, I am listening as well, because what I'm seeing right now is an awful lot of suffering. And, I feel like my job on this earth is to minimize suffering as much as I can. And so when I see a candidate, and again, nobody's ever going to be perfect, but I'm sure inspired to hear somebody talk about something other than the
yeah,
differences between all of us.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, this is great, Dr. Moslener. I appreciate you so much. I hope you're staying, warmish over there in Michigan, and I hope that the winter isn't too brutal on you.
Thank you. Yeah, I may come visit.
Well, I appreciate you, and I hope that you and that everybody here has a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Great to be with you.
Take care, everybody. Bye bye. Thank